Welcome to a rather dark evening here in the UK. The Centre for Myth, Cosmology and the Sacred is delighted to be hosting Vicky Field, whose talk is Imaginary Gardens and Real Toads. A little bit about Vicky before I hand over. Vicky is a writer, poetry therapist and researcher. Her recent books are a poetry collection, A Speech of Birds, and a memoir of pilgrimage and marriage, Baggage, a book of leavings, both from Frances Bootle. She also writes fiction and drama. She was named in Poetry Review as a pioneer in the use of poetry for healing in the UK, and she works in the community and has a particular interest in public libraries and people living with dementia. She's a course director at the Professional Writing Academy and a visiting tutor at the Metanoia Institute and the University of Glasgow, and previously at the Universities of Sussex, Falmouth, Teesside, UAB and Bristol. And she contributes a regular column to Dyslexia magazine on crafting a cure. Her doctoral research at Canterbury Christ Church University is on narratives of transformation and pilgrimage, and she taught courses in writing the earth and women poets of the spiritual for Canterbury Christ Church also. So Vicky, it's a pleasure to host you. I think you've asked for people to remain muted during your talk, and then at the end you'll open up to questions and people can then feel free to unmute.
Yeah, lovely. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, big thank you to you all for coming this evening. And this is very much a first for me to give a talk for the Centre for Myth, Cosmology and the Sacred in the new form online. So a huge thank you to Angela, Louise and Mary for inviting me. I very much see my work as sitting in the framework of myth, cosmology and the sacred. And when the MA was at Christ Church University, I was lucky enough to contribute a couple of sessions on stimulating creativity using poetry. And I know that the graduates of that course included several poets and at least one editor. So poetry, myth, cosmology and the sacred have got a lovely, lovely synergy. So it feels like an honour and also a privilege to be giving this talk to you this evening. So what I'm going to do is speak for 45 minutes to an hour, but please don't panic or go off and make cups of tea, because I'm going to invite you to do short pieces of writing and reflection as we go through. And I think what that might do is it might deepen your response to some of the things that I'm sharing and also prompt some questions. So we'll have time at the end for some questions. So poetry, myth, cosmology and the sacred. How do these things align? I think poetry acts in the same way that myth does, in that it tells us a deeper truth. So a poem quite often may be simple on the surface, but there's always a hinterland. Just as a myth might tell stories about two characters or three characters who've got certain challenges and quests, there will be an underlying meaning, and that meaning can change over time. So one of the characteristics of poetry for me is that it's endlessly fruitful to look at the same poem over and over again. Similarly with myths, we can read the same myth and we find new depths because we're different at different times of life. So poetry and cosmology, and that's a bit of an odd one. So let's think about cosmology, astronomy, obviously, and there are many very scientific poets or poets who draw on science in their writing. But when we think about cosmology and poetry, I'm thinking more here about what we might loosely describe as the stars and the heavens. And as soon as we say words like stars and heavens, then we're in the realm of the poetic. And if we think about religious cosmology or spiritual cosmology, that really means that we're experiencing our existence in a way that has something that goes beyond our individual lives, our individual daily lives. And there are patterns, there's order, there's mystery, and all those things can be plumbed by poetry. So myth, cosmology and the sacred. Well, obviously there's secular poetry, and the poetry world in the UK is traditionally a very secular world. But I think poetry has always spoken to the sacred. So I'm very interested in poems that somehow give us some connection with the divine. And when I say the divine, again, I'm talking about something that is beyond our individual selves and our small concerns. So it doesn't necessarily mean a traditional deity. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to take on board religious dogma. But I think what it means for me, and what I think poetry does, is it gives us a reminder that we exist in multiple dimensions. There's more to us than meets the eye. You know, we know that. There's more to us than meets the ear. We know that very well. There's more to us than meets the Zoom screen. You know, we have many, many dimensions. So poetry can build connections that go beyond the individual. And that's why I think it is an incredibly powerful medium, especially when we work with poetry in groups, or we share poems together. Recently, I heard Kate Fox, a comedian, and a poet, speak at a conference. And she said, poetry makes us bigger on the inside. And I found that a very beautiful, paradoxical statement. Poetry makes us bigger on the inside. So poems, small things, but paradoxically, they can make us bigger on the inside. So, as I said, we're going to do a bit of writing as we go along, and the title of my presentation is Imaginary Gardens and Real Toads. So I'm just going to invite you to take a minute just to free associate to those two words, gardens and toads. And when I say free associate, that just means write whatever comes into your mind. It might be a memory, it might be an association, it might be something about the sounds of the words. Just a few seconds just to generate some thoughts about gardens and toads. Okay, you can just put ... or if you've got something interesting, leave a few lines to come back to it later. Very, very simple exercise just to do a bit of word association. But if we were able to share all of those in this group, we'd find that all kinds of contrasting things might have come up. Some of them might be personal, some of them might be cultural, some of them might be linguistic. So if a poem is something made of words, the individual words can all yield resonances that go well beyond their literal denoted aspects. So some of you may have come across this phrase before, imaginary gardens and real toads. I took it from a poem by the American modernist poet, Marianne Moore. So she had a long life through most of the 20th century. And she was very exercised by writing a poem that she called Poetry. And this particular poem, which she wrote in 1919, which wrote her first draft in 1919, she said about poetry, I too dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. Interesting opening line for a poem about poetry. Okay, so she dislikes it, but she's very exercised by trying to define it. What is poetry? What are we talking about here? She says there are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. Fiddle, another interesting word, it's a noun and a verb. you know, what is it? What is it that's important beyond it? But what is it that poetry can do for us? So we've got a bit of a paradox already. And then this is the opening line of a poem. She's talking to somebody. She's talking in the I voice, and she's telling us something. I too dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. Later on in the same poem, and you can find this poetry very easily online, there's the phrase where she's got the toads and the gardens. So she says here, nor till the autocrats among us can be literalists of the imagination, above insolence and triviality, and can present for inspection imaginary gardens with real toads in them, shall we have it? And by it, she means poetry. So how are we going to have poetry? So poetry can't happen until the literalists of the imagination can present us with imaginary gardens with real toads in. I think there's some interesting words in here as well. She says autocrats, the autocrats amongst us. So I think poetry is not autocratic. It doesn't speak, well, it speaks to the individual, but it also speaks to the collective. So poetry is an open art in which we can all find ourselves. There is some didactic poetry, and I think we know it when we see it. Often if a poem is telling you what to do, there's a sense of retreating. I think the best poems are open. We can find ourselves in them. So if we think of that garden again, the poetry garden is a rich, open, varied garden. And as we know, any garden is always in a state of flux. There's many things growing in a poetry garden. So back to this real toads and imaginary gardens. I think when we create something imaginary, we're also creating something real. So here we're in the realm of this myth cosmology and the sacred. The imaginary is real. We could argue about the technicalities of that, but I think the two things go together. Or another way of phrasing it is we might be able to create something literal, but we're putting it into an imagined framework. And the last little bit that I wanted to pick up from Marianne Moore's poem is this phrase for inspection, present for inspection. So a poetry is a thing that we can present to others and we can inspect it. So if a poem goes out in the world, if a poem is shared, then it's presented for inspection. So a poem is something that is real, it exists. It might be on the page, it might be in your memory, you might be able to quote a poem to us. We have this idiom, we talk about a poem being had by heart. And if we think of a poem that we know by heart, then we're talking about something that's actually embodied inside us. And when I was thinking about that, I was reminded of Terry Waite, the Archbishop's special envoy to the Middle East, who was imprisoned in solitary confinement for many, many months. And he said that having poems by heart was one of the ways in which he was able to survive that ordeal. So we can actually have a poem in ourselves, in our bodies. Right, so let's look at a poem. This is a very short poem. Have all the birds begun to make their nests, except for you and me? What now are we waiting for? So with your notebooks there, I just want you to just make a couple of notes about this poem. What do you think the tone of the poem is? Who do you think might have written it? What kind of voice is it in? What time of year are they writing this poem? And what do you think might be going through the mind of the person that's written this poem? So what I'm showing here is that reading is an active process. So this poem exists, it's an extant poem, but immediately we're entering into the poem and we're making the poem our own. This is an act of creation, the reading of the poem. You're imagining a voice, you're imagining a person, you're imagining a concern that's led to the poem. So it's a poem that's actually in translation. So this is the original poem. Hebben alle vochala nestas hachunan, hinas ik enda tu, bot I bindenui nu. Okay, I've no idea whether I've read that in the original voice, but you could look at that original poem and you can see the impression of the translation. So the word we is in there in the last line. That's there. Maybe thu at the end of the third line. That's a bit like thou. We've got the word vochala, birds. So that's got the impression of fowl in English. So with any poem with words, we've always got this, what Ted Hughes called a kind of mycelia under the surface. So the words go back a very long way. We can also see that this original poem rhymes and it's much, much tighter. So this is a poem that's considered to be the first poem written in the Dutch language. And if you get an anthology of Dutch poetry, it's usually the first one in the book. And it was discovered not far from where I'm zooming in from, in Rochester. This is Rochester on the North Kent coast. And it was discovered in 1932, and it was written on the flyleaf of an 11th century manuscript. So that poem goes back to 1075. So at the top there, you can see the original, which is now in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. No one's quite sure who the author is, but because of the situation, because it was 1075 and it was somebody writing, you can see it's rather beautiful handwriting, it's thought to have been a monk, probably from Flanders. And he was probably working in a scriptorium, which meant that he spent his days copying out manuscripts. One theory is that he'd just sharpened his quill. So he was just doodling, just like we might do with a biro to see if a biro is working. But maybe there's more to it than that. Maybe it's a rhyme from childhood. It looks like a little children's rhyme. Just thinking, if you think about your own childhood rhymes, whether there's one that you remember. If there is, you might like to just make a note of it. It might have just floated up from your unconscious mind that there might be a childhood rhyme that you remember. Another theory is that because of the subject matter about birds and nesting, is that at the time in the 11th century, that was a common concern for women. So maybe the poem originated with a woman and the monk was simply writing it. So what's happening? This is an unusual poem that we're starting with. The person writing the poem is describing something perennial. It's spring. The birds are making their nests. So it was happening in probably 1075. It's happening in 2021, and we hope it'll happen again in 2022. He's speaking in the first person. He's also connecting two ideas. The birds are nesting, and then we've got a you and a me. So what's happening with the you and the me? He's bringing two ideas together. He's witnessing some sort of emotion. I think there's a sense of yearning in this poem. What now are we waiting for? There's an idea that he actually wants something. And also it's catching a moment in time. So it's a tiny fragment, but for whatever reason, it was captured and put down in writing. So we've read this poem, we've actively read it, we've thought about it, you know, what's going on here, what's happening. And I think one of the important aspects of poetry, especially with poetry therapy, is that it's reciprocal. The poet Kate Clanchy, I heard her at a conference once talking about reading a poem as being like a footprint on wet sand. So if you imagine putting your foot on wet sand, you lift it up and the seawater fills up the imprint. If we think about our psyches, we read a poem and it somehow imprints on ourselves, our emotions, our cognitions, and then our own material comes up to meet it. So I'd like to use this 11th century poem just for all of us to create a very small poem in the present moment here. So I invite you to just look around your immediate environment and note down something that's happening. Just a very short note. So it could be the sky is darkening, the dog is sleeping, the computer's humming, the light is shining. Just note something that is happening in your own environment, just very briefly. So what we've done there is we've taken our consciousness outward. So I could see on the screen some people just looking around. We're moving out into the environment. So now let's turn our consciousness inwards and just make a quick note about something that's happening inside you. Again, a very brief thing. So it could be something like, my mood is also somber. My dog is barking outside. Actually, that's outside. Something that's happening inside you. I'm feeling hungry. I'm worried about tomorrow. Something that's happening inside. And then finally, end that very short piece of writing with a question. So just like the poet has done back in the 11th century. So the poet Paul Matthews, some of you may have come across him at Emerson College. In his book, Singing the Creation, he talks a lot about poetry being a movement between the inner and the outer. So when we write a poem or when we experience a poem, we're looking at the innerness of outer things and the outerness of inner things. And that's exactly what this poet is doing in this very short fragment, looking out at the birds making their nest and then looking inwards at emotions related to this mysterious you and me. So we've got inner and outer. So you're probably saying that what you've written, may not feel like a real poem. But I think what we're doing here is we're using the word poem in quite an elastic way. So one way of thinking about what is a poem is that it's a thing made of words. But clearly a poem isn't an instruction book, it's something more than that. And when I was thinking about this talk, I was looking at what it is that I think makes a poem a poem. And the three dimensions I came up with were form, metaphor, and rich ambiguity. That's form, metaphor, and rich ambiguity. I know some of the poets watching this might have a different list, and I'd be really interested to know what's on yours. So, a poem exists, as we've said. I've said you can have it on the page, you can have it in memory, you can have it by heart. So beginning with the idea of form, a form suggests an entity. I've shown you this slide because it relates to a very interesting poetry project, and I really recommend that you spend some time with this if you're interested in poetry. And the form that poems take for the Poetry Exchange is that they see poems as being friends. So the Poetry Exchange is a project where people share poems that have been friends to them, and they talk, for the purposes of a podcast, about this poem that has been a friend. So if a poem is a friend, that begs the question, what sort of friend is it? And with the Poetry Exchange, we often hear comments like, it's a loyal friend. It's a friend who reminds me who I am. It's a friend who tells me that things will get better. So the whole poem is personified as a friend. But we might also think of other forms that poems can take. So something that's often said is that a poem is a portal. And a portal is a word that I've heard quite a lot recently, particularly in terms of the really huge changes that are going on in our world around us, that we could see it as some terrible hole that we're all going to fall in, or we could see it as a portal that might carry us from one way of thinking, one kind of consciousness, to a new kind of consciousness. When I've been involved with the Poetry Exchange, talking to people about poetry as friends, and we sometimes ask that question, what kind of friend? People might say, oh, the poem is like a window. It showed me a new way of thinking. Or the poem was like a door. It made me step through to a new stage in my life. It gave me permission. Quite a common one is that a poem is a mirror. We can read a poem and we see ourselves reflected back. Another one that's often used, and it's a therapeutic term, is that a poem is a container. So it's a small thing where we can put very complicated material. So for example, the poet Edna St. Vincent Millay wrote a sonnet, and she opened her sonnet. The sonnet is a 14-line poem. I will put chaos in 14 lines and keep him there. And I find that very powerful. I will put chaos in 14 lines and keep him there. So a sonnet, because it's got very strict rules, can act like a cage. And if you've got some huge emotion like chaos or grief or trauma, this tight container can help to hold it. Contemporary poet Jacqueline Safra, she wrote 100 sonnets during the first lockdown, one for every day of the lockdown. And she said that it was a gift for enabling her to process events and the news. So again, the poem as container. So I'm going to show you another short poem. This one is by Langston Hughes. And it's a poem that has got a huge subject matter, but it's just in 8 lines. So I'll read it. Island. Wave of sorrow, do not drown me now. I see the island still ahead somehow. I see the island and its sands are fair. Wave of sorrow, take me there. So I'll put it on just one slide because it might be easier for you to see it. Wave of sorrow, do not drown me now. I see the island still ahead somehow. I see the island and its sands are fair. Wave of sorrow, take me there. So another first person poem, and it's also a lament. Just invite you to read it a couple of times yourself, and if it's appropriate, perhaps read it aloud, or imagine that you're reading it aloud, and make a note of what you experience bodily when you read that poem. So this is as I said, a short poem, just 8 lines. It's a very powerful poem to read chorally. I've often done that in groups. You've probably all got your own quite personal bodily reactions to the poem, but when we read it aloud, especially if there's a number of people reading it simultaneously, people often comment that it has the sensation of waves. And that's a bodily sensation that people often associate with grief, that we say grief comes in waves, and that as the grief subsides, the waves get less intense. So we're talking here about form, and this is it's a rhyming poem. It's only got 8 lines, and it's also got a lot of repetition in it. That word, the wave of sorrow, repeats. I see the island repeats. So actually there's very, very few words there. And yet paradoxically, for me, it's a huge poem. It seems to say an awful lot. So when we think about poetry and form and how the form affects our consciousness, I'm reminded here of how poems could be chants. This poem has got an incantatory quality to it. Could be a spell, could be an evocation. Probably a lot of us have got some of the old prayers or religious poems like the Psalms that create echoes in our bodies, things like, the Lord is my shepherd, the things that we hear at certain ritual occasions, hymns, liturgies. There's also poems that are lullabies or comfort us. Ballads is another form where we have a bodily reaction to the poem. So this poem, the form is important. It's also got a very big metaphor in it, and I'm going to say a bit more about metaphor later on, but while we're looking at Island, I think it might be interesting for you just to reflect on Island, this island with the fair sands, and just write a couple of notes about what the island means to you. It might be something very specific, or it might be something a bit abstract. What is your island? What is the island that you see ahead that you may be carried towards? Okay, form. So that poem, in some sense, it's fixed. Those 8 lines, you'll find that in anthologies, you'll find it on the internet, you'll find it copied out and sent to people. But there's a paradox again. I think the more I think about poetry, the more paradoxes are central to what the poetic is. And a poem exists, it's extant, it has a form, and yet it's always in the process of changing, particularly through being read by different people at different times. So the word poem itself comes from poesis, and it's defined as an activity in which a person brings something into being that did not exist before. So thinking about just the short notes that you're making, you're bringing something into being. You know, that thought, if you hadn't written it down, would have been fleeting. It would have gone. And poesis is etymologically derived from the ancient Greek term poes, which means to make. So it's an act of making. And I think it's really important that it's an activity, it's ongoing, it's happening. So just a little bit of philosophy behind it. I rather like this idea from Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, who explained poesis as that coming into being. And he had some rather lovely metaphors for that. The blooming of the blossom, the coming out of a butterfly from a cocoon, the plummeting of a waterfall when the snow begins to melt. So there's a moment, something doesn't exist, and then it comes into being. So something moves away from being one thing to become another. So the bud becomes a flower. The cocoon opens to reveal a butterfly. The waterfall suddenly emerges out of the frozen snow. So that threshold moment, ektasis, obviously closely related to ecstasy, when something moves away from its standing as one thing to become another. So poetry is transformational. It's a kind of becoming. And I'm very aware of that, again, from work in poetry therapy, where we can read a poem in a group and there's a sense of a realization coming into being. Quite often people will sigh, they might sit back, they might put their hand on their heart. There's a connection between this rather strange thing, words on a page, and consciousness. There's something that leaps between the two. There's a threshold when we get a poem. So that moment, I think, that becoming is really, really important. So that was Heidegger, a philosopher. One of my favourite poets, who I follow on Facebook and read everything she writes, is Jane Hirshfield. And Jane Hirshfield spent many years as a Zen Buddhist nun, so she's very concerned with the spiritual of poetry. And she has another way of expressing this sense of transformation, this changing. So she says, a poem is not bottled wine stored in a cellar. It is a transforming engagement with life that is both within and beyond its own words. How this happens in any particular poem will vary. That it happens is what makes a poem a poem. So a lot in that. She has a metaphor to start with. A poem is not bottled wine stored in a cellar. It's not fixed. It is a transforming engagement with life. Big word. That is both within and beyond its own words. So again, we have this small thing on the page, whether it's the monk's poem about spring or Langston Hughes's poem about sorrow, and it bursts out of that structure. It's beyond. It's in the structure and it's beyond. How this happens in any particular poem will vary. That's certainly true. Not every poem works for everybody. Some people will just not get a poem or say, oh, this does nothing for me, but others will connect through the poem. The emphasis on that is my emphasis. That it happens is what makes a poem a poem. So she's saying that the transforming engagement is absolutely central to what it is that a poem is. Okay, so moving on to metaphor. Been collecting cartoons about poems. Quite like this one. Why we need poetry. Your eyes are like eyes. Your lips are like, well, they're like lips. So we're very, very used to describing one thing in terms of another. Those of you that have read Ian McGilchrist will see that, especially at the end of The Master and his Emissary, he talks about metaphor as being absolutely central to human thought and our ways of making connections. So I've got a definition here of metaphor, and I've highlighted the bottom of it from the Greek metaphora, a transfer, especially in the sense of one word to a different word, a carrying over, a change. Meta, over, across, ferrin, to carry, to bear children. I was very amused to learn that in Greece, there's actually a make of small van, or at least there used to be, called a metaphor, that went around carrying tomatoes and onions to shops around the cities. So metaphor, carrying something from one place to another. And for me, the central part of a metaphor is that I think it carries information from our conscious daily brain, your lips are like lips, to our dreaming brain, our brain that's making connections over and beyond the so-called material reality around us. So my love is like a red, red rose. We're immediately into another dimension rather than just simply saying, your lips are like lips. So here's a metaphorical poem, a very, very famous one. I'm sure some of you will have come across it before. It's called Guest House, and I'll read it. Guest House. This, being human, is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still treat each guest honourably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice. Meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. This poem is one of those poems that has travelled the world. We might call it a viral poem, but perhaps in a positive sense. I've seen it pinned up on notice boards in day centres. It appears on social media time and time again. So it's obviously answering some question that is in our consciousness at the moment. And it opens with a very direct statement: this being human is a guest house. That's a metaphor. So I'm just going to invite you to perhaps come up with a few more metaphors for what it means to be human. So Rumi opens the poem, this being human is a guest house. You might have some other ideas. So see if you can come up with perhaps at least 3 metaphors for what it means to be human. So once we have a metaphor, then it's possible to develop that. Your metaphors that you've just come up with now, they might form the first line of a poetic exploration about what it means to you to be living this life at this time. So for Rumi, the idea of the guest house means that there are people coming in and out. It's not a permanent home. Every morning there's a new arrival. There's also another aspect of metaphor here, that he's personifying the emotions that are coming. So joy, depression, and meanness come into the house. A crowd of sorrows might empty out all the furniture. He's then also, and this is something we might consider a bit didactic and want to disagree with, saying that we should invite in the dark thought, the shame, and the malice. You might want to argue with that. And then we've got the enigmatic last lines about each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So again, we might think we want to be grateful, we might not be grateful, but how would it be to explore that? So by starting with that metaphor, Rumi has opened another space for us to think about what it means to be this human being and to have all the different emotions that we go through during a day, what we might say to those emotions, whether we might let them into our house or whether we might decide we want to close the door. And whatever your metaphor is, you might want to explore that in some depth. So kind of an interesting metaphor, this, and I thought I'd just give a little bit of an aside. Jane Hirshfield, who I mentioned earlier with the quotation about the transformational energy of poetry, she has compiled an anthology of women's spiritual poetry. And when she was editing that, somebody asked her what the difference was between women's spiritual poetry and men's spiritual poetry. And her answer was that women write much more about houses. And I found that really intriguing, and I'm sort of ticking that over. So again, if anybody has any thoughts about the house business, then yeah, I'd be very interested to hear that. Again, thinking about poetry and consciousness, amazingly, Rumi was one of the best-selling poets in the United States in the last century, and yet he was writing in the 13th century. He was writing in Persian. He was a Sufi mystic and ended up living in Konya, which is now in eastern Turkey. So we've got this voice that is speaking to us in an incredibly modern way. And that's largely because of the translations by people like Coleman Barks and Robert Bly. So I'm thinking again about poetry not being fixed. If something's translated into a different language, we enter the poem afresh. It's always transforming, and it's always transforming us. Okay. Yeah, I just thought I'd put this little image up here. I mean, who knows what Rumi looked like, but if you look on the internet, there's all these images of Rumi. And he's also become an Instagram phenomenon. So there are lots of little quotes that come out of his poems. I just find that interesting again about poetry escaping poetry. So he's become a force for inspiration and solace outside of his original writing. I often wonder what he would think about his role in our lives now. So the third thing that I wanted to mention that I think is really important for poetry is rich ambiguity. What I mean by that is that the poem doesn't tell us what to think. So Rumi's poem had some injunctions in it, but we can discuss those and argue with those. If it's a piece of doggerel in a birthday card, then there isn't rich ambiguity. But I think all poems that are useful from the point of view of myth, cosmology, and the sacred, and exploring consciousness always have this hinterland where there's always another reading. And what that means is we can live with the same poems all our lives and still get more from them. I've certainly got a list of poems that I really treasure because they always give me some new thought. So I'm sharing a poem here by Izumi Shikibu, who was writing in Japan. And again, we're looking at more than 1,000 years ago, which I find quite extraordinary. And it's a short poem, and it goes like this. Although the wind blows terribly here, the moonlight also leaks between the roof planks of this ruined house. Again, we've got the house image. So although the wind blows terribly here, the moonlight also leaks between the roof planks of this ruined house. So I wish we could spend an hour discussing this short poem. I think there is just so much in it. There's something about needing to be ruined in order for the moonlight to get in. I'm reminded of the Leonard Cohen song about where the light comes in. Because she's writing in Japan at the time she is, the moon is a symbol of Buddhist awakening, so it could have a very culturally specific register. It could be that the ruined house is the result of some sort of trauma, and there's a bit of hope there because although the wind is blowing terribly, the moonlight is still coming in. So it's a very, very small poem that opens up a big world, part of that interesting paradox about poetry. Okay. So I'm just moving towards a conclusion here. This is a list of some of the mechanisms by which poetry might help us in terms of understanding more about this mysterious business of being human. So I took this from a book by Sherry Reiter, who's a very well-known poetry therapist in the United States. And she has a book of essays in which people describe different ways in which they've used poetry to overcome certain challenges and difficulties. So mastery. If we can put chaos into 14 lines, we're starting to get some sort of control over things that are complicated and maybe difficult to manage. Ritual, that's very central to religious practice and practices of the sacred, and also with New Age rituals. We're finding ways in which to embody and to really celebrate in a meaningful, repetitious way the things that are important. And I think ritual, particularly with poetry, whether there's a ritual of reading it, writing it, sharing it, is a way in which poetry can bring some spirituality back into places where there might not be much. I'm thinking here particularly of working with groups with people living with dementia, and how the ritual of reading and writing poetry together can be very sustaining. A poem can offer a bit of safety. If you're just thinking about 4 lines, you've got something small. It's an act of witness. So thinking back to our monk in Rochester, he witnessed what was happening for him. In the short exercise that you did, you witnessed something that was going on for you. Perhaps the paradox, we've got safety, but we've also got freedom. Anything can happen in a poem. Another paradox, we can vent in a poem, but we can also contain it. So the idea, again, of writing something in a few lines can be extremely safe because we've only got a few lines, we can't get out of control, but we've got an opportunity to say what's important, what we really want to say. As I hope I've demonstrated in the talk, poetry is outside of time, space, and matter. We can speak to a 13th century Sufi mystic, we can speak to an aristocratic Japanese woman, and we can share those particular concerns that they're sharing with us. So Sherry talks about the magic of the poetic, and I think it is a magical transformational process. Creativity, we've all got a need to be creative, and sometimes it's difficult to fit that into our modern life with all its pressures, but poetry offers a chance to be creative, both as a writer and as a reader. And I think it is also an integrative process. It's a way in which we can bring things together and make a whole. So a poem has got all those different images in it, but it's also one thing. So here's another funny that I thought was quite entertaining. The public library with the deep end and the shallow end. I think poetry does take us into the deep end. I was quite intrigued by this image that it's got lore even deeper than poetry. Don't know, might be quite a fun exercise to make your own sort of continuum of deep and shallow. So, but I think so poetry can exist on the surface as well. As I said, that's another paradox about poetry. It's both deep and surface at the same time. Okay, just going to see. Oh, here's another one that really entertained me. Are you still doing that poetry blog? Yeah, I love it. It makes me feel like a much larger audience is ignoring my work. So that's from the poet's point of view. I mean, it's often said that more people are writing poetry than reading it. That it's a very small world. I think that's certainly true of the professional poetry world, but I know that just from being out and about in the community that the poetic is absolutely everywhere. Certainly work with the Poetry Exchange. All kinds of people have got a favourite poem. It cuts across all demographics. There's something in it for everyone. So what more did I want to say just as we get to the end? Okay, I'm not going to bother with that one. I think I'm going to stop sharing and just talk about a couple of other things. Les Murray, the late Australian poet who was always being tipped for the Nobel Prize. He never quite won it. He has an article in the Guardian, which is quite easy to find online. And thinking about this business of integration, he talked about his poetry as coming from a bodily self, an everyday self, and a dreaming self. And I think those three aspects, or those three dimensions, for me are really helpful. So our everyday self tends to dominate. We tend to forget that we've got bodies until they start being a nuisance or being problematic. But poetry, I think, is an embodied art. We talk about inspiration, and inspiration is exactly the same word as breathing. Poetry comes from the breath. If we think about the etheric body, that is made up of our breath. Where do we start? Where do we stop? And then the dreaming self, that's a whole big topic on its own. But I think in our dreams, that's where all the possibilities exist, all the lives that we may have had, all the things that we may have done, we are doing in this way of being, this state of consciousness that is beyond time. So we're talking about kairos rather than chronos. We're in an eternal space when we're dreaming. And I think when we tap into metaphor and poetry, then we are really getting towards that dreaming self. And also, again, I think if we access that, we're moving beyond this illusion we have of individuality. This idea that we're cut off from other kinds of consciousness. So poetry is a way of integrating. It's a way of being connected and open, and it's also a way of enhancing our experience of the world as in our everyday self. So I'm just going to close by inviting you to do a final bit of writing reflection. Thinking about the Guest House poem, Rumi is saying, welcome and entertain them all. So I'm going to just invite you to think about perhaps something that is missing from your life at the moment, an emotion or an activity that you would like to welcome more of. And so just take the sentence stem, I will welcome, and just think of what you might welcome into your life.
That's wonderful, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, there's lots of lovely words of thanks, and people seem to really have enjoyed it, saying it's a wonderful talk. And yeah, so I think we've all felt that we've gone through something ourselves, actually, through being present here with you, and have been taken through into different spaces ourselves and places in our minds and hearts. So thank you, Vicky, so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. It'd be wonderful to have you back, Vicky, next year sometime. And how can people contact you? Do you have a website that you can sort of let everyone know about?
I've got an absolutely moribund website, but my email is in the public domain. It's victoria@thepoetrypractice.co.uk.
That's lovely. Thank you. So if anyone wants to contact Vicky, then please do get in touch. Also, just to say that just huge thanks to you, Vicky, for being with us tonight. It's been wonderful. It's awakened something in me. Absolutely. I just want to thank you so much for that. And yeah, do keep in touch with us at the Centre for Myth, Cosmology and Sacred and the events that we're running. And yeah, look forward to working with you again very soon, Vicky.
Thank you so much.
Kiss to Angela.
And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Hopefully see you again.
Good rest of the evening.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.